A duke visits his late daughter's grave, only to find a weeping groundskeeper holding a small child. The stone was still too new, too white, the inscription too sharp. Lady Catherine Ashford, beloved daughter, gone too soon. Edward Ashford, Duke of Thornmere, stood in the rain staring at words that shouldn't exist for a girl of 19. And then he heard it, a child's cry piercing the autumn storm. He turned to find a young man kneeling beside Catherine's grave, soaked to the bone, clutching a small bundle wrapped in what looked like his own coat. The groundskeeper's face was streaked with tears and rain, and when he looked up at the Duke, his eyes held such raw grief that Edward staggered backward. "Your Grace," the young man choked out, his voice breaking, "I'm so sorry. I promised her I would keep him safe. I promised I would never let you find out. But he's sick, and I don't know what to do, and she's gone, and I—" His words dissolved into sobs as the child wailed again, and Edward's world shifted on its axis, because that cry, that face emerging from the bundled coat, had Catherine's eyes. Wait, before the next confession unfolds, if this story has already stirred your heart, tell us where you're watching from. To make sure you don't miss the next betrayal, kiss, or redemption, subscribe and join our circle. The next heartbeat might change everything. Now, back to the scene. Edward's knees buckled. He grabbed the iron fence surrounding the family plot to steady himself, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. The child, no more than 4 months old, had Catherine's distinctive green eyes, her dark curls already beginning to show despite his age. "What do you mean, promised her?" Edward's voice came out strangled. "Who are you?" The young man, he couldn't be more than 22 or 23, struggled to his feet, cradling a crying infant against his chest with a tenderness that spoke of practice. "I'm Thomas Hartley, Your Grace. I work here, maintaining the grounds. Lady Catherine and I, we—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "You were lovers." It wasn't a question. Edward felt the ground shifting beneath him, felt the careful construct of his understanding crumbling. Catherine, his precious daughter, his only child since his wife died giving birth to a stillborn son 10 years ago. Catherine had borne a child in secret and died, and he'd never known. "We loved each other," Thomas corrected quietly, with a dignity that cut through his tears. "I know what it looks like, Your Grace. A groundskeeper and a duke's daughter. But it was real. She was real with me in a way she couldn't be with anyone else." The baby's cries intensified, becoming desperate. Thomas tried to soothe him, bouncing gently, but the child was inconsolable. "How long has he been crying?" Edward heard himself ask, his duke's training taking over even as his heart shattered. "Hours. He has a fever, won't eat. I've tried everything, but I don't have money for a physician, and I couldn't bring him to the manor without—" Thomas's voice cracked again. "I didn't know what else to do. I came here to ask Catherine what to do, and then you— Give him to me." Edward stepped forward, arms outstretched before his mind caught up with his body. "Thomas," his arms tightening protectively around the child. "Your Grace, that's my grandson." The words felt foreign in Edward's mouth, impossible and yet undeniably true. "Give him to me." Slowly, reluctantly, Thomas passed the bundle over. The moment Edward took the child in his arms, muscle memory from Catherine's infancy flooded back. The weight, the warmth, the way an infant molded against your chest. But this child was burning with fever, his small face flushed and pinched with discomfort. "He needs a physician immediately." Edward looked at Thomas, seeing past the sodden clothes and tears to the young man beneath. Strong features, intelligent eyes, calloused hands that spoke of honest labor. "Come, both of you, to the manor, now. Your Grace, I couldn't. You can and you will." Edward's voice took on the tone that had commanded regiments in his youth. "My grandson is ill, and you're the only person he knows. I'm not heartless enough to separate an infant from his caretaker when he's already lost his mother." Thomas stood frozen, clearly torn between hope and fear. "I'm not going to punish you for loving my daughter," Edward said more gently, surprising himself with the truth of it. "I'm angry, yes, devastated that she kept this from me. But this child is innocent, and he's Catherine's legacy. I won't let him die in the rain while we stand on ceremony." That decided it. Thomas nodded and followed as Edward strode toward the manor, his long strides eating up the ground. The rain was coming down harder now, but Edward curved his body over the infant, protecting him as best he could. Inside, the staff's reactions ranged from shock to horror as their duke appeared soaking wet with a screaming infant and a bedraggled groundskeeper in tow. "Mrs. Winters," Edward barked to his housekeeper, "send for Dr. Braxton immediately. Have him come to the nursery, and prepare a room for Mr. Hartley, guest chambers, not servants' quarters." "Your Grace," Mrs. Winters' eyes were wide with confusion. "Do it, now. I'll explain later." He climbed the stairs to the nursery wing, unchanged since Catherine's childhood, and laid the infant on the changing table. In the better light, the resemblance to Catherine was even more striking. The shape of his face, the set of his mouth, even the way his hair curled at his temples. "What's his name?" Edward asked as Thomas hovered anxiously nearby. "James. Catherine wanted to name him after her grandfather." Edward felt something twist in his chest. His own father, dead these 20 years. Catherine had listened to his stories, had loved hearing about the grandfather she'd never known. Of course she would choose that name. "How old is he?" 4 months and 2 weeks. He was born—" Thomas' voice caught. "The birth killed her. There were complications. She bled, and we couldn't stop it. And by the time we thought to fetch help, it was too late." "We?" Edward looked up sharply. "Who else knows about this?" "My sister, Sarah. She's a midwife. She helped with the birth, tried to save Catherine. She's been helping me care for James since, but she has 4 children of her own, and her husband—" Thomas trailed off, the implication clear. His brother-in-law didn't approve of the arrangement. Dr. Braxton arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand, his expression carefully neutral as he examined the screaming infant. "Lung fever," he pronounced after a thorough examination. "Not severe yet, but it will be if left untreated. He needs to be kept warm and dry, needs medicine 4 times daily, and someone must monitor him through the night. The next 48 hours will be critical." "I'll do it," Thomas said immediately. "I've been caring for him since birth. I know his needs." "You'll do it together," Edward interrupted. "You know the child. I have the resources. Between us, we'll keep him alive." Dr. Braxton looked between them, clearly bursting with questions, but too professional to ask. "I'll leave the medicine and instructions. Send for me if his condition worsens." After the doctor left, Edward and Thomas faced each other across the nursery, the baby finally quieting as the first dose of medicine began to work. "Why didn't she tell me?" Edward asked, the question that had been building since the graveyard. "Why hide this? Did she think I would cast her out? Disown her?" Thomas sank into the rocking chair, Catherine's rocking chair from her own infancy, his exhaustion evident. "She was afraid, Your Grace, not of being cast out, but of what you would do to me." "To you? She knew you'd blame me, see me as a fortune hunter or a predator." "She couldn't bear the thought of you having me arrested or transported or worse, so she hid it, pretended to visit friends when she was actually in a cottage I'd arranged on the far edge of the estate. She gave birth there, planned to raise James there in secret while maintaining her place at the manor. That's insane." Edward's voice was harsh. How long did she think that could last? She knew it couldn't last, but she hoped, we both hoped, that maybe with time you'd soften, that we could find a way to tell you that wouldn't end with me in prison and James labeled a bastard. Edward wanted to rage that his daughter had underestimated him, that he would never have been so cruel. But would that have been true? 6 months ago, if Catherine had appeared with a groundskeeper lover and an infant, how would he have reacted? He wanted to believe he would have been understanding, but honestly, he probably would have had Thomas horsewhipped and thrown off the estate. His daughter's honor, the family name, the scandal, those would have been his first thoughts, not love or happiness or what Catherine actually wanted. You said the birth killed her, Edward said, moving to look down at James, now sleeping fitfully in the crib. Tell me what happened. Thomas's face went gray. It was a long labor, too long. Sarah said something was wrong, that the baby was positioned badly. When James finally came, Catherine was already weak from blood loss. Sarah tried everything she knew, but the bleeding wouldn't stop. By the time Catherine realized she was dying, it was too late to send for a proper physician. She died alone, without me. The guilt was crushing. She wasn't alone. I was there. Sarah was there. And she held James, got to see him, got to tell him she loved him. Thomas's eyes filled again. Her last words were to make me promise I'd keep him safe, that I'd never let him feel unwanted or ashamed. She made me swear I wouldn't tell you unless I had no other choice. And tonight? Why tonight? Because I'm failing her. Thomas's composure finally broke completely. I'm just a groundskeeper, Your Grace. I make 12 pounds a year. I've been spending every penny on milk and cloth for nappies and coal to keep him warm. I might lose him too, and I couldn't let Catherine's son die because I was too proud to break my promise. The young man dissolved into sobs, and Edward felt something in his chest crack wide open. This wasn't a fortune hunter or a seducer. This was a young man who had loved his daughter enough to sacrifice everything for her child, who had been caring for an infant alone while grieving the woman he loved, who had broken his sacred promise only when the alternative was watching that infant die. You won't lose him, Edward said quietly, and you won't do this alone anymore. Whatever Catherine feared, whatever she thought I would do, that man died with her. The man I am now, the man standing here looking at his grandson, I just want to know him, to do right by him, to honor Catherine's memory by protecting what she loved most. Thomas looked up, hope and fear mingling in his expression. What does that mean, Your Grace? It means you'll stay here, both of you. We'll get James well, and then we'll figure out the rest. The scandal? Damn the scandal. Edward surprised himself with the vehemence. Catherine is gone. I can't protect her anymore, can't make her happy, can't do any of the things a father should do. But I can protect her son. I can make sure he grows up knowing he was loved, that he came from love. Everything else is secondary. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of medicine doses, temperature checks, and endless worry. True to his word, Edward and Thomas took shifts watching over James, learning to work together despite the vast gulf of class and circumstance between them. During the long night hours, they talked. Edward learned that Thomas came from a respectable but poor family that had been educated by a parish priest who saw promise in him, that had taken the groundskeeper position at Thornmere because he loved working outdoors and had a gift for growing things. Catherine found me in the rose garden, Thomas said quietly during one midnight watch. About a year ago. I was pruning, and she came out to sketch. We started talking about the flowers, and she had so many questions, smart questions about grafting and soil composition and why certain varieties thrived here while others didn't. She loved learning, Edward murmured, remembering his daughter's endless curiosity. We kept meeting, accidentally at first, then deliberately. She'd bring her sketchbook, I'd teach her about the plants, and we'd talk for hours. About everything. Books, philosophy, dreams, fears. She told me about losing her mother, about how lonely she was being the only child of a duke, how everyone treated her like porcelain instead of a person. I did that, Edward admitted. After my wife died, Catherine was all I had left. I wrapped her in cotton wool, terrified of losing her too. I thought I was protecting her. You were, but she needed to live too, not just be protected. Thomas adjusted James's blanket with gentle hands. When we fell in love, she said it felt like breathing for the first time. Like she'd been holding herself so carefully for so long, and suddenly she could just be. The ache in Edward's chest intensified. He'd failed his daughter in ways he was only beginning to understand. He'd been so focused on keeping her safe that had never considered whether she was happy. Did she regret it? At the end, he had to know. No, never. Thomas's voice was firm. Even dying, even knowing what it would cost. She said, loving me and having James were the best things she'd ever done. She said, his voice broke. She said she was sorry she couldn't stay, but that she'd lived more in 1 year with me than in all her previous years combined. Edward turned away, not wanting Thomas to see the tears streaming down his face. His daughter had been happy, had loved and been loved, had created a life, even if she hadn't lived to see him grow. It wasn't the life Edward would have chosen for her, but it had been hers, fully and completely hers. I would have come around, he said finally, if she'd told me, if she'd brought you to me. It would have taken time, but I would have accepted you, accepted this. I wouldn't have chosen to lose her over it. She knew that deep down. But, Your Grace, you have to understand. It wasn't just about you accepting me. It was about all of it. The scandal, the social consequences, what it would mean for James. She wanted him to have a chance at a real life, not to be whispered about as the bastard grandson of a duke. She was going to wait until he was older, until she could present him as a foundling she'd decided to adopt. Give him respectability, even if it meant hiding his true parentage. It was a terrible plan, doomed to failure, but Edward could see the logic in it from Catherine's perspective. She'd been trying to protect everyone, her father's reputation, her lover's freedom, her son's future. And it had killed her. On the 3rd day, James's fever finally broke. He woke hungry and alert, reaching for Thomas with a gurgling laugh that filled the nursery with light. Edward watched Thomas feed the infant with practiced ease, saw the love in every movement, and felt the last of his resistance crumble. "You're a good father," Edward said. Thomas looked up, startled. "I'm not his father, Your Grace. Not legally, not in any way that matters. You're the one who's cared for him since birth. You're the one he reaches for when he cries. Blood matters, yes, but so does this. So does showing up every day, putting his needs before your own, loving him unconditionally." Edward moved closer. "I want to acknowledge him, legally, publicly. I want James to be recognized as my grandson, Catherine's son, but I won't do it if it means erasing you from his life." "What are you proposing?" "Stay. Work here, not as a groundskeeper, but as something more. His guardian, perhaps. I can't give you legitimacy. The law won't allow it, but I can give you a place in his life, in this family." Thomas stared at him. James clutched against his chest. "Why would you do that?" "Because Catherine loved you. Because you've proven yourself worthy of that love. And because James deserves to know the man who's been his father in all the ways that truly count." Edward sat down heavily. I'm 53 years old, Thomas. I'm tired, and I'm grieving, and I've just had my entire understanding of my daughter rewritten. I don't have the energy for spite or pride or class consciousness. I just want to do right by my grandson, and I can't do that without you. The scandal will happen regardless. The moment I acknowledge James, people will ask questions. Let them. I'll tell the truth, that Catherine had a son, that she died in childbirth, that I'm raising him as my heir. What they choose to believe about the circumstances is their concern, not mine. Your heir? Thomas's voice was faint. His my grandson, my only grandchild, likely my only descendant. Of course he'll be my heir. Unless, Edward paused, unless you want something different for him. You're his father in every way that matters. If you want to take him away from here, raise him elsewhere, I won't stop you. I'll provide for you both, make sure you have everything you need. And never see him again? Thomas shook his head. No, Your Grace. James deserves to know both sides of his heritage. Deserves the opportunities being your grandson can provide. I won't take that from him out of pride. He took a shaky breath. I'll stay. Not as his guardian, that would raise too many questions, but as someone employed in the household, someone who can be near him, help raise him, make sure he knows about his mother, about where he came from. His tutor, perhaps, when he's older. I'm not qualified. You were educated by a parish priest. You've read extensively. You're intelligent and curious. You're more qualified than half the tutors in England. Edward managed a small smile. Besides, who better to teach him than someone who loved his mother? You can tell him things about Catherine I never knew. Give him stories I can't provide. Thomas's eyes filled with tears again. You're a better man than she feared, Your Grace. No, I'm just a man who's lost too much to let pride cost him anything more. The household adjusted to the new arrangement with varying degrees of grace. Mrs. Winters was scandalized, but ultimately pragmatic. A baby in the house was a baby in the house, regardless of circumstances. The other servants whispered, but followed their duke's lead. The real challenge came 3 weeks later when Edward's sister, Lady Beatrice Ashford, arrived for her annual visit. Edward! She swept into the drawing room in a rustle of expensive silk. I came as soon as I heard the most ridiculous rumor. Someone told me you'd taken in a bastard child and were claiming him as... She stopped dead as Edward stood, James in his arms. The baby had filled out in the past weeks, his cheeks rosy with health, his green eyes bright with curiosity. Hello, Beatrice. I'd like you to meet your great-nephew, James. Beatrice's face went through a series of expressions: shock, horror, calculation, and finally, as she looked at the baby, reluctant recognition. Catherine's child. Yes. Dear God, Edward, the scandal. Do you have any idea what this will do to the family name? I don't particularly care. Edward bounced James gently. He's Catherine's son, my grandson. That's all that matters. That's not all that matters. Beatrice moved closer, her voice dropping to a furious whisper. Who's the father? Was she married in secret? Is there a legal claim? The father is dead. The lie came easily. Thomas had offered it as the simplest solution. He was a merchant's son, respectable enough, but he died before they could marry. Catherine bore the child in secret and died in childbirth. It was close enough to the truth to be believable, and it protected Thomas from the worst of the scrutiny. Beatrice's expression softened slightly. So the child is illegitimate. He's my grandson. I've had the birth registered, acknowledged him publicly. As far as I'm concerned, he's my heir. You can't be serious. An illegitimate heir? The House of Lords will never accept it. Then they can contest it after I'm dead. In the meantime, James will be raised as the grandson of a duke, with all the education and advantages that entails." Edward's voice was iron. "This is not a negotiation, Beatrice. It's a fact. You can accept it or not, but I won't be argued with about my own grandson." Beatrice studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're just like father, stubborn as granite once you've made up your mind." She reached out tentatively to touch James's hand. "He has Catherine's eyes. He has everything of Catherine. Her smile, her temperament, even the way Edward corrected himself, throat tight, the way he studies things. Catherine would stare at objects for hours, trying to understand them. He does the same thing. May I hold him?" Edward passed James over, watching as his sister cradled the infant with practiced ease. She'd had 5 children of her own, all grown now with children of their own. "He's beautiful," Beatrice said softly. "And you're right, he's absolutely Catherine." Anyone with eyes can see it. "Will you help me?" Edward asked. "With society, with managing the scandal? I need him to be accepted, Beatrice. I need him to have a chance. It won't be easy. An illegitimate heir will face barriers. Then we break through them, together. Please." Beatrice looked at James, then at Edward, and something in her face softened. "Catherine was my favorite niece. If this child is what she left behind, then yes, I'll help. But Edward, you need to be prepared for the fight ahead. Not everyone will be as accepting as I am." She was right. Over the following months, as news of James's existence spread through society, reactions ranged from sympathetic to scandalized. Some peers refused to acknowledge the child, others whispered about Catherine's shame, and a few even suggested Edward was being deceived. But Edward stood firm. He introduced James to anyone who would accept the introduction, told Catherine's story with enough truth to be convincing, and dared anyone to question his grandson's place in his household. Thomas remained in the background, officially listed as estate manager in training, but actually spending most of his time helping care for James. Edward had given him rooms in the family wing, scandalous in itself, and encouraged him to be present for all of James' milestones. "He said Dada today," Thomas said one evening, appearing in Edward's study with James on his hip. "I know he doesn't mean it, he's just babbling, but it matters." Edward set down his papers. "It matters that he sees you as a father figure, Thomas. That's important." "Is it? I worry sometimes that I'm confusing him. You're his grandfather, the Duke, the one who can give him everything. I'm just his father, in every way that counts." Edward stood and crossed to them. "James will grow up knowing he had a mother who loved him enough to die for him, a father who sacrificed everything to protect him, and a grandfather who learned humility through loving them both. That's not confusing, Thomas. That's blessed." Thomas's eyes filled with tears. They still did easily when discussing Catherine. "She'd be so grateful to you, for accepting him, for accepting me." "I think she knows." Edward reached out to touch James's cheek. "Sometimes I swear I feel her here, watching over us, making sure we don't mess this up." "Do you think we are? Messing it up?" "No. I think we're doing the best we can with an impossible situation, and I think that's all anyone can ask." As James grew from infant to toddler, the household found a new rhythm. Edward cut back on his social obligations to spend more time with his grandson. Thomas taught the boy about plants and animals, taking him on long walks through the estate. And together, they kept Catherine's memory alive through stories and laughter and love. "Tell me about Mama," James would ask as he got older, sitting between Edward and Thomas at bedtime. And they would tell him. Edward would describe Catherine as a girl, her curiosity, her stubbornness, her talent for sketching. Thomas would share their courtship, carefully edited for young ears, emphasizing the love and laughter they'd shared. "She loved you very much," Thomas always ended. "She wanted you more than anything in the world." "Even though it made her die?" James asked one night. his 5-year-old face serious. Edward and Thomas exchanged glances. "She knew the risks," Edward said carefully, "and she chose you anyway. That's what love is, James, choosing someone else's happiness over your own safety. I wish she didn't have to choose." "So do we," Thomas said softly. "So do we." When James was 6, the first real crisis arose. Another claimant to the dukedom emerged, a distant cousin who argued that an illegitimate heir invalidated the succession. "He's filing a legal challenge," Edward's solicitor explained, arguing that James's parentage disqualifies him from inheriting the title and estates. Edward sat in his study, Thomas beside him, had insisted the younger man be present for all discussions of James' future. "Can he succeed?" Thomas asked. "Possibly. The law is unclear on this matter. An acknowledged illegitimate child can inherit property, but not necessarily titles. If the cousin pushes hard enough, takes it all the way to the House of Lords." "Then we fight," Edward said firmly. "I'll petition for a special remainder, get the king's approval if necessary. James is my heir, and I'll be damned if some grasping cousin steals his inheritance." The legal battle consumed the next year. Edward spent a fortune on solicitors and bribes, called in every favor he'd accumulated in decades of public service. Beatrice worked tirelessly in society, building support for James's claim. And Thomas? Thomas provided the most compelling evidence of all. "Letters," he said one evening, producing a bundle wrapped in ribbon. "From Catherine. I kept them all. She talks about her love for James, her plans for his future, her hope that you would one day accept him. If we present these in court, show that she fully intended him to be acknowledged as your grandson." Edward stared at the letters. Catherine's handwriting, her words, her hopes and fears laid bare. "You've been keeping these secret?" "They're private, between me and her. But if they help James, if they secure his future, she'd want me to use them." The letters proved devastating in court. Catherine's voice, speaking from beyond the grave about her love for her child and her trust in her father's eventual acceptance, swayed even the skeptical judges. Combined with Edward's clear devotion to James and the undeniable resemblance between grandson and grandfather, the case for James's legitimacy grew stronger. But the cousins' lawyers had one final card to play. The father, they argued in court. If the father is indeed dead as claimed, there should be a death certificate, a grave, some evidence of his existence. The complete lack of documentation suggests the entire story is fabricated. Edward felt the blood drain from his face. They'd been so focused on protecting Thomas that they'd never considered this angle. The judge looked at Edward sternly. "Your Grace, can you provide any evidence of the father's identity or death?" Edward opened his mouth, unsure what to say, when Thomas stood. "Because I'm not dead, Your Honor. I'm the father." The courtroom erupted. Edward grabbed Thomas's arm. "What are you doing?" "The right thing, finally." Thomas pulled away and faced the judge. "My name is Thomas Hartley. I was Lady Catherine's lover. James is our son. The Duke lied about my death to protect my reputation and his family's honor. But I won't let that lie cost James his inheritance." "Mr. Hartley," the judge said sternly, "you realize what you're admitting to? The legal consequences?" "I do, Your Honor. I seduced a duke's daughter. I fathered an illegitimate child. I helped conceal the truth from his grandfather. Whatever punishment you deem appropriate, I'll accept. But James is innocent. He deserves his place in the world." Edward stood, his heart pounding. "Your Honor, if I may, Mr. Hartley didn't seduce anyone. My daughter loved him freely and chose him willingly. The fault, if there is fault, lies with me for creating an environment where she felt she couldn't be honest about that love." "Regardless of who seduced whom," the cousin's lawyer said triumphantly, "the father is revealed as a groundskeeper. Surely this proves the child is unsuitable as a ducal heir? Why? Beatrice's voice rang out from the gallery. She stood, imperious and elegant. Because his father works for a living? Because he's not some idle aristocrat drinking and gambling away his family's fortune? Thomas Hartley has more character and integrity than half the peers in this room. The judge banged his gavel. Order! This is highly irregular. So is challenging a duke's choice of heir? Beatrice shot back. My brother has acknowledged this child. The boy clearly carries the family bloodline. Whether his father is a lord or a laborer should be irrelevant. It's not irrelevant, the cousin's lawyer argued. Class matters. Breeding matters. A duke's heir must what? Edward interrupted. Be born of the right marriage? Have the right pedigree? James has the bloodline. He has the intelligence. He has the moral character to be a good duke someday, taught by a father who actually works for a living and understands what that means for his tenants. I'd argue that makes him more qualified, not less. The judge looked between the parties, clearly uncomfortable with the philosophical direction the case had taken. This court will recess for deliberation. Outside the courtroom, Thomas turned to Edward, his face pale. I'm sorry. I should have asked you first, but I couldn't let them win because of a lie. Even if it means nothing, Edward said firmly. You think I'll punish you for telling the truth, for standing up for your son? Thomas, I'm proud of you. But the scandal was always inevitable. You've delayed it 6 years, gave James time to establish himself as my grandson before the full truth came out. That's more than enough. The deliberation took 3 days. When the court reconvened, the judge looked grim. This case has raised questions of law and precedent that exceed this court's authority. Therefore, I'm referring the matter to the House of Lords for final determination. In the interim, James Hartley, he paused at Edward's sharp intake of breath. The child's legal name is Hartley, not Ashford. In the interim, he will remain in the Duke of Thornmere's custody pending final determination of his status. It was a temporary reprieve, not a victory, but it meant more time, more chance to build their case. The case consumed another year. The House of Lords debated questions of legitimacy, inheritance, and class with an intensity usually reserved for matters of war and taxation. Edward testified, as did Thomas, Beatrice, and dozens of others who'd known Catherine or who'd seen Edward's devotion to his grandson. James, now 7, understood enough to know his place in the world was being decided by old men in wigs. "Will they take me away from you, grandfather?" he asked one night, his small face worried. Edward pulled him close. "Never. Even if they strip away the titles and the estate, you'll always be my grandson, and you'll always have a home with me." "And Papa?" James still called Thomas Papa, despite the awkwardness it caused in society. "And your Papa. The 3 of us are family, James. No court can change that." Thomas, listening from the doorway, felt tears prick his eyes. In the 7 years since Catherine's death, he and Edward had built something unprecedented. A true partnership in raising James, a mutual respect that had deepened into genuine affection. "I never imagined this," Thomas said later, after James was asleep. "Having you as, not quite a friend, but something." "Family," Edward said. "We're family, Thomas. Unconventional, scandalous, probably unprecedented, but family nonetheless. Catherine would have loved seeing this, you and me working together for James. She's seeing it. Somehow, I know she is." The House of Lords finally reached their decision on a cold February morning. Edward, Thomas, and Beatrice sat in the gallery, hands clasped, waiting. The Lord Chancellor stood to deliver the verdict. This body has debated at length the question of James Hartley's legitimacy and his right to inherit the Duke of Thornmere's title and estates. We acknowledge the unprecedented nature of this case. A duke publicly claiming an illegitimate grandson and naming him as heir despite the existence of other legitimate claimants. Edward's grip on Thomas's hand tightened. However, we must also consider precedent and law. The rules governing succession exist to prevent chaos and uncertainty. To overturn them for one case, however sympathetic, would set a dangerous precedent. Edward felt his heart sink. Therefore, it is the determination of this body that James Hartley cannot inherit the dukedom of Thornmere. Thomas made a choked sound. Beatrice's face went white with fury. However, the Lord Chancellor continued, we also recognize the Duke of Thornmere's right to dispose of his personal property as he sees fit. The title must pass to the legitimate line, in this case to Lord Richard Ashford. But the estates, properties, and personal wealth belong to His Grace and may be bequeathed to whomever he chooses. We encourage the parties to reach an equitable arrangement. It wasn't what they'd hoped for, but it wasn't complete defeat. James wouldn't be a duke, but he could still inherit the wealth and properties. He'd still have security, status, a place in the world. Edward stood, his voice carrying through the chamber. My lords, I accept your ruling. The title may pass to my cousin, but I hereby declare my intention to divide my estate. The title and one property, the smallest, least profitable, will go to Lord Richard as required by law. Everything else, the wealth, the productive estates, this very house, will go to my grandson, James. You can't, Lord Richard sputtered. I absolutely can. You get the title you fought so hard for, Richard. Congratulations, you're the Duke of Thornmere. But the dukedom will be a hollow honor, with almost nothing attached to it. Enjoy your crumbling estate and your precedence at table. James will have everything that actually matters. The House of Lords erupted in argument, but there was nothing they could do. The law allowed a peer to dispose of his property as he wished. If Edward chose to strip the title of its wealth before passing it on, that was his prerogative. Outside, Thomas turned to Edward with wonder in his eyes. You just dismantled your entire legacy out of spite. Not spite. Love. Edward smiled. The title is just a word, Thomas. What matters is the land, the wealth, the ability to provide for those you love. James will have all of that, and he'll have it without the burden of a dukedom that would have spent his whole life questioning his legitimacy. Catherine would be proud. Catherine would be laughing. She always did love it when I got stubborn. They walked home together, Edward, Thomas, Beatrice, and James, through the London streets to the townhouse. That evening, they celebrated with a quiet family dinner. What happens now? James asked. He was old enough to understand he'd lost something, but young enough not to fully grasp what. Now we go home, Edward said. Back to Thornmere. We plant gardens and raise horses and live our lives without worrying what anyone else thinks. And when I grow up, when you grow up, you'll be a wealthy landowner with the best education money can buy, taught by your papa and your grandfather. You'll be able to do whatever you want with your life. Be whatever you want to be. Even if I want to be a gardener like papa? Thomas and Edward exchanged glances, then laughed. Even if you want to be a gardener, Edward confirmed, though I suspect you'll aim a bit higher. I don't know, James said seriously. Papa makes things grow. That seems pretty important. Thomas pulled his son close, his heart full. It is important, but so are other things. The point is, you'll have choices. That's what we fought for. Your right to choose your own path. 5 years later, Lord Richard Ashford, Duke of Thornmere, sat in the crumbling manor house that represented his entire inheritance and contemplated his life choices. The title had brought him nothing but debt and obligation. Meanwhile, James, now 12 and showing every sign of becoming a remarkable young man, lived in comfort and security just 10 miles away on what everyone still called the real Thornmere estate. It galled Richard, but there was nothing he could do. Edward had won, completely and thoroughly, by sacrificing the very thing Richard had fought so hard to obtain. At the estate, Edward sat in his study, the same study where he first confronted Thomas about James's existence and reflected on the strange path his life had taken. He was 65 now, his hair completely white, his back a bit stooped, but he was happy in a way he'd never expected to be after losing Catherine. "Grandfather?" James appeared in the doorway, tall for his age, already showing signs of the man he'd become. "Papa sent me to find you. Dinner's ready." Papa! Thomas had never stopped being Papa, despite the scandal and the gossip and the inevitable whispers. Edward was grandfather, Thomas was Papa, and somehow that worked. "Coming. How were your lessons today?" "Fascinating. Papa was teaching me about crop rotation and soil quality. Did you know you can actually improve land over time rather than exhausting it?" Edward smiled. His grandson had Catherine's curiosity and Thomas's practical intelligence. He'd grow into someone remarkable. Not a duke, perhaps, but something better. Someone who understood both privilege and work, who'd been raised by 2 fathers who loved him enough to fight the entire aristocracy for his sake. "Your mother would be so proud of you," Edward said as they walked to dinner together. "I wish I could have known her." "You do know her. She's in every story we tell, every value we've taught you, every choice we've made for your sake. Catherine lives on in you, James. Never doubt that." At dinner, Edward looked around the table. Thomas at one end, Beatrice visiting again, James chattering about his day, the servants moving with comfortable familiarity. This strange, cobbled-together family had become his whole world. "A toast," Edward said, raising his glass, "to Catherine, who started all this with her courage to love across boundaries, and to the family she created, unconventional as we are." "To Catherine," they echoed. And in the candlelight, Edward swore he felt her presence, warm and approving, happy that her son was loved and safe, pleased that the 3 people she loved most had found a way to love each other. "Thank you," he whispered into the comfortable noise of dinner conversation. "Thank you for James. Thank you for showing me what matters. Thank you for the gift of this impossible family." The candles flickered, and Edward smiled. Somewhere, somehow, his daughter heard him, and she was smiling too. James grew into a fine young man, educated by his 2 fathers in everything from classical literature to modern agriculture. When he was 16, Edward sat him down for a serious conversation. "You're old enough now to understand everything that happened. Your mother's choice, the scandal, the legal battles, all of it. I want you to hear the full truth before you become a man." They talked for hours, Edward and Thomas together, laying out every detail they'd sheltered him from. James listened quietly, processing, and finally spoke. "So, you're not actually brothers," he said to Edward and Thomas. "You're just 2 men who loved my mother and decided to love me together." "That's exactly what we are," Thomas confirmed. "And you gave up being a duke for me, grandfather?" "I gave up a title. I kept everything that mattered." James looked between them, his young face serious. "I'm the luckiest person in the world, aren't I? Most people get 1 father. I got 2. And both of them love me enough to sacrifice everything." "You are lucky," Edward agreed. "But not because of what we sacrificed, because of what we gained. This family, strange as it is, has brought me more joy than a dozen dukedoms." "Me too," Thomas added. "I loved your mother with everything in me. Losing her nearly destroyed me. But raising you with your grandfather, building this life together, it gave me a reason to keep going. It gave both of us a reason." "Then I guess we're all lucky," James said. "Because I got two fathers who love each other enough to put aside everything society says should divide them. That's rare." He was right. It was rare, but it was real. When Edward died peacefully in his sleep at 73, Thomas and James were both at his bedside. His last words were to James, "Live well. Love freely. Don't let anyone else's rules dictate your happiness." James inherited everything, just as Edward had promised. He used the wealth to continue his grandfather's work, improving the lives of tenants, investing in education and agriculture, becoming known as one of the most progressive landowners in England. And Thomas? Thomas lived on the estate until his own death 30 years later, serving as James's advisor, friend, and beloved papa. He taught James's children about growing things, told them stories of their grandmother Catherine, and proved that family was built through love and choice, not just blood. The night before Thomas died, James sat with him in the old nursery, preserved exactly as it had been when James was a baby. "Thank you," James said, holding his father's aged hand, "for everything, for loving my mother, for raising me, for being my papa when the whole world said you shouldn't be." "Best decision I ever made," Thomas said, his voice weak but clear. "Loving Catherine, fighting for you, building this family with Edward, all of it." "Will you tell her I love her when you see her?" Thomas smiled. "I've been telling her that every day for 37 years. But yes, I'll tell her again. And I'll tell her you're happy, successful, loved. That her son became exactly the man she hoped he'd be. Because of you and grandfather. Because of Catherine. We just followed her lead." Thomas died peacefully that night, and James buried him in the family plot beside Catherine and Edward. 3 headstones in a row. Lady Catherine Ashford, beloved daughter, gone too soon. Edward Ashford, Duke of Thornmere, grandfather, friend, father of the heart. Thomas Hartley, papa, gardener, beloved. And beneath all 3, a single inscription James had added. Together they created a love that transcended class, scandal, and death. In honoring each other, they taught us all what family truly means. Visitors to the estate would sometimes ask about the unusual arrangement of the graves, about the story behind the inscriptions, and James would tell them the truth. Not the sanitized version, but the real story of how his mother had loved a groundskeeper, how his grandfather had learned humility through grief, and how 2 men from completely different worlds had put aside pride and prejudice to raise a child together. Some listeners were scandalized, others were moved to tears, but all of them left understanding something fundamental: that love, real love, doesn't follow society's rules. It creates its own rules, builds its own structures, and transforms everyone it touches. James lived to be 87, saw his grandchildren and great-grandchildren carry on the family legacy, and never regretted the scandal that had defined his childhood. Because that scandal had given him something rare and precious, a family built on love rather than obligation, on choice rather than chance. On his own deathbed, surrounded by descendants who carried the blood of both Catherine and Thomas, James smiled and whispered, "Thank you, Mama. Thank you for being brave enough to love Papa. Thank you for giving grandfather and Papa each other. Thank you for starting all this." And in the garden outside, beneath the willow where Catherine had once sketched while Thomas worked, the flowers bloomed eternal. a testament to the love that had started it all and the family it had created against all odds.